today and kind of go through a few different things. So starting off with the agenda was sent out. I always like to just kind of look over that. So really, we'll do some welcome introductions, updates, not a whole lot that we'll get into there, but I figured we will go around real quickly and just kind of do an icebreaker, warm up a little bit, and then jump into it. And really the overall objective for today is starting to really weave the 20-year strategy together. Still a lot of work to go, but really starting to dive into it. So we want to kind of look at that whole strategy together, kind of from the beginning to the end of where we are, and then heading towards a written draft and kind of the process to wrap up the report by the end of June. We will take a break there. We extended it by an hour. So we'll take a break and then we'll continue on that conversation, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up and talk about the next meeting in April 11th. So with that too, I also want to say Dan Seaman is in the house. He is in the ODF headquarters, and it's really nice to have Dan here. And we're going to be spending the next couple of days really digging deep in different conversations, different meetings, and really working together over the next couple of days. So really happy to have Dan here. So any questions on the agenda before we jump into it? All right. So first off, I figure we can just go around. Like I said, we got some time together. Just real quickly, just kind of a quick hi, and then maybe to warm up, icebreaker, what are you looking forward to for springtime? I'll let you know that I'm definitely excited about the weather starting to change and starting to see the sun a little bit more, but I'll get into that in a minute. So we'll kind of go around. So first, John, I got you in the upper left. Just want to say a quick hi and kind of what are you looking forward to spring?
Yeah, John O'Keefe, Rancher Adele. You know what I'm looking for right now is enough warm nights that we run the snow on the desert and fill a few water holes where it's kind of iffy whether the snow is going to melt or kind of just evaporate. I think that's what I'm looking for.
Excellent. Thank you, John. And Dave, good to see you.
Yeah, Dave Wiley, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. I'm looking forward to turkey season.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. Susan Jane.
Hi, everybody. Susan Jane Brown, Wildlands staff attorney with the Western Environmental Law Center. What am I looking forward to? That was a good question. I guess I'm looking forward to finding out which of my garden plants made it and which did not over this winter, because it's been a little rough for all of my plants. So I hope to see all their little heads popping up soon.
Thank you. Joseph.
Well, the snow is really coming down here right now, so it's hard to think about spring, but so maybe I'll just see how long I can take this ski season into the spring.
That's good. Thank you much. And Pete, good to see you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Pete Caligieri with the Nature Conservancy. Snowing here too in Central Oregon. Hard to think about spring when there's so much more new snow in the passes right now. If I had to look out though, I am looking forward to in a couple months to morel season again and doing some foraging. So I'll be out there for that.
All right, excellent. Sounds like fun. Katie.
Hey everyone, Katie Wolstein, Range and Fire Specialist with OSU Extension. I guess like Susan Jane, I'm looking forward to taking stock of the yard, and because I don't think I've seen it since November. We've just had snow and it's just stayed, so we'll see what's going on in there.
All right, thank you. And Jim, good to see you.
Afternoon. Wow, let's see. I'll say one season closer to the end of session. How's that?
All right. Enjoy some summertime too. Excellent. Oriana, nice to see you.
Nice to see you all. Hey, it's Oriana Monero with Verde, and I'm looking forward to some big life changes. I'm starting a new job in April, so that's a pretty exciting thing for me.
Thank you, Oriana. Marco.
Good afternoon, everyone. Marco Bay, Lomakatsi Restoration Project. I've had about a 1.5 feet of snow in my house since October. I love snow, but I am looking forward to some clear ground. So.
All right. Starting to sense a theme here with the snow. I think everyone's kind of getting over it. So understood. Carl, got you next.
Hi, Carl Morgenstern. I was with Eugene Water Electric Board, but I retired March 1st. So I'm now representing the Upper Willamette Soil and Water Conservation District, where I'm a director at. So happy to still be here.
Thank you, Carl, and congratulations. Dylan, nice to see you. Just kind of an icebreaker. What are you looking forward to for spring?
I'm looking forward to not having taken phone calls in the 4th floor of the Capitol like Macaulay, maybe getting outside and doing more of them.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining. Good to see you. And let's see here. I think I just saw around. So Amanda, you are available.
Yeah, sorry if I end up cutting out. My internet has not been the best today, so I'm going to stay off video for now. But yeah, Amanda Sullivan-Astor, I'm with Associated Oregon Loggers. And my daughter is actually getting baptized next month. So we're really looking forward to that. She's going to get that done in Chicago with her cousin, who's just a month older than her. So we're really excited to have the cousins all meet and have a good time with lots of family together. So looking forward to that.
Excellent. Thank you. Next I have Sean.
Yeah, hi folks. Sean Gordon at the Institute for Natural Resources at OSU. We had a few flakes here last week again in Portland, but it's mostly mud. And so I'm looking forward to a little drying of the mud and less mud on the dogs when we get home.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. Good to see you. Megan.
Hi there, Megan Frizzell with the planning branch here at the Oregon Department of Forestry. I'm looking forward to an upcoming trip with our kids for spring break, flying to Minnesota. So it's always fun flying and getting somewhere different with 2 young children.
All right. Thanks, Megan. And Dan?
Dan Seaman here in beautiful Salem. I'm with American Forests and helping to sort of put this all together, as you all know. I think the thing that I'm looking forward to with spring is all of the flowers popping out of the ground eventually. I'm based in Seattle, so it's a little bit easier for them than sounds like everybody else, but the crocuses and the daffodils and all the flowers popping out of the trees and things heralds hope. So
excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and round us off. So Nathan Beckman, Strategic Planning Coordinator, ODF. My spring, we're going to be welcoming another child here pretty soon. So we're pretty excited about kind of rounding off the family, which will be our last, but really excited for that. And yeah, just that. And spending some time outside with the kids, not in the mud. Kind of some themes going on here. So really appreciate it. Good to see everyone. Always nice to kind of open that up. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and jump into it right now. Kind of the plan, as always, since last time we met, a lot of work has been happening, and really starting to bring this thing together is really the goal. And we'll talk at the end, kind of like where we are with kind of putting this together in written draft and getting a report done by June 30th, and then move into implementation. So I'll go ahead and start off. I'm going to kind of provide a high-level overview. A lot of this stuff we've seen, we know about, but hopefully it lays the context, and then Dan's going to facilitate the last portion of the conversation as we jump into it. So all right. So have the slides up. If y'all can't see it, just give a shout out and we'll make sure, but otherwise I'll assume that you can see it. So really jumping in from the very beginning, once again, just a reminder of everyone, really what our task is. This is the language that we've been following over the last year. And once again, part of Senate Bill 762, sections 18 through 20 in landscape resiliency, wildfire risk reduction, but really rooted in the 2019 shared stewardship MOU, really where this language came from, and really been looking at a shared stewardship approach and putting this together. So just wanted to lay that context, the language, really the guiding light of what we've been looking at with this strategy. What I did want to hit on too is where the strategy is really looking at, from the MOU and Senate Bill 762 and a couple key documents and strategies that have been put together, one of them being the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, and those 3 legs of the strategy. And with that, as well as the Governor's Wildfire Council that has been helping guide this strategy, looked at those 3 legs of the cohesive strategy, and really within the Restore and Maintain Resilient Landscapes, 8 recommendations within the Governor's Wildfire Council, and following those recommendations, helping support the 20-year landscape resiliency strategy, and then also Senate Bill 762, formed within the 3 legs of the cohesive strategy. And what I really want to express here is the 20-year strategy we're putting together is really looking at that restoring and maintaining landscapes and looking at the resilient landscapes aspect of that. But really, it's critical to be focused there, but also understand that the fire adapted communities and the wildfire response aspect of it is extremely important as well, and how this strategy can help support those efforts and vice versa, but really focusing in the landscape resiliency aspect of it. So just wanted to kind of hone in on that piece of it, and just a reminder, that's where we've been headed. And then also just looking at some graphs of where we've been over the last 30 years, and looking at acres burned by the decade. And as we can see in each decade, we're just seeing an increase in acres burns, the average acres burns, and then per fire seasons, we're starting to see those numbers skyrocketing as well. So really, what we're really looking at trying to do is how to reduce the severity of wildfires, reduce the amount of acres, really creating resilient landscapes to kind of reduce this overall wildfire risk. And then also suppression costs, another aspect in it. Looking at some graphs here of what have our large fire suppression costs been within the last 2 decades. And really within the last decade, our suppression costs have been skyrocketing as well. And our average has really gone from 17 million to 85.5 million. And those numbers are quite staggering. And once again, by looking at the cohesive strategy as a whole, reducing wildfire risk and really focusing on the landscape resiliency aspect of it, how can we also reverse this trend and start getting into lower suppression costs by creating landscapes that can be more resilient to wildfires and really minimizing the impact of catastrophic wildfires in the landscape. So just kind of laying some context here too, at some numbers that we're looking at, and the hope is to, in the next 20 years, to start reversing this trend, would be one of our overall objectives that we really want to see. So, and then also with that too is, well, how do we do that? And that's where the strategy, kind of that background that we've really been looking at, starts to fit together. Kind of starting on the vision of creating the healthy and resilient landscapes. In the way that the strategy is really looking at doing that is with the shared priorities and the coordinated actions and investments. And really that's the key piece of shared stewardship and the key piece of the 20-year strategy. And what we're going to dig into later as well is where are these areas where we have shared priorities? We want to coordinate our actions, coordinate our investments, large landscape scale, cross-boundary projects to be looking at the healthy and resilient landscapes. And the way we're looking at doing that is 2 aspects of it. One of them is having a governance structured engagement. We'll hit on that here in just a second. But you could have governance and engagement. If you don't have a strategy, then you are just kind of communicating. We really want to say, okay, what is our strategy over the next 20 years in alignment with that governance structure, and saying, we just produce a strategy, it's another shelf document. We really want to make sure that the 2 of them are working together to really get us to those shared priorities, coordinate actions and investments, and getting us to those healthy and resilient landscapes. So really the key components. We laid this foundation at the very beginning, and once again, what we've been following to really thinking about how are we over the next 20 years going to be putting this together, et cetera. So wanted to just kind of, once again, overview what are those key components of shared stewardship. And then to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, we started off as well saying a vision amongst the agencies. What is the vision of what we want to try to achieve? And that's where that healthy and resilient landscapes, supporting Oregon's social, economic, and ecological goals. So that's the vision we've been looking at, and really that high level guiding light of where we want to go. But then also looking at strategic elements, and 7 strategic elements were produced. And these are to really provide a lot more specificity of where we want to go and how this strategy is being guided, where our investments are being guided, our priorities, our engagement, et cetera. So reminder that we have those 7 strategic elements, and we've been following those from the beginning and really thinking about how we are incorporating that into all aspects of the strategy. So wanted to, once again, just kind of a reminder of how these pieces, the early vision and the early pieces have been getting us to where we currently are. And then once again, talking about the governance piece of it, kind of an overall view of what is our governance. We have our strategic leadership group, which is the state forester and the regional forester, our directors, really providing that overall high level leadership and that guidance and overall endorsement of the strategy. And then moving down, we have our agency coordination implementation group that's been meeting twice a month and really helping put the strategy together, providing guidance, providing resources, and really making sure that we're kind of heading in the right direction through shared stewardship. And as we move into implementation, a lot of these roles will shift as well, but keeping the strong foundation. And then, of course, the stakeholder body that we currently have sitting right here, who we are talking to, a group of 18 from diverse backgrounds representing lots of different interests, and really, as you all are fully aware, helping guide the strategy and helping us move to where we are, and really thankful for that. And then also working with the sovereign nations, and just a reminder, been working through the pre-existing channels with those sovereign nations in the different channels that we have within the agencies and the different groups that we've been working through. And then also our tribal liaisons getting together has been really strong as well, helping inform the strategy and communicating over time as well. So continuing that, and over the next 20 years, bring that. And then also the regional engagement aspect. And we'll talk a little bit more about that regional engagement, but the partnerships and collaboratives, the local resources, and making sure that that engagement is continually occurring through the development of the strategy, and then also through what is the overall implementation of it. So just kind of a high level overview, and then the need for communications, and then also the science and resource assessments. And we'll dig into that a little bit as well. So wanted to look at this overall framework and that idea of the governance with the strategy really fitting together. So we will then jump into the strategy, which is really the main reason that we're here today to talk about it. And before we do, I just wanted to take a pause there. And if there's any reflections on that, we've talked a lot about this in the past, but reflections on that, and kind of any thoughts, or otherwise we're just kind of continuing to proceed, and we'll jump into the actual strategy development. So I'll go ahead and pause there for a second. Pete.
Yeah, Nathan, maybe you could just share with me a little bit of, the slides that you just shared with us. I appreciate the recap. Are these intended to be used sort of broadly, as you've done in other sort of overview presentations, say for Board of Forestry or others? Are these going to be externally facing or guide your presentation of the 20-year strategy as we begin to near rollout?
Yeah, I mean, I'll plan on continuing to present this just to provide high level, big picture view of it. We're going to plan on putting this stuff in the strategy as well, just to provide that vision in that direction. So all of this will go in there, and that's why we kind of wanted to view it. So hopefully that answered the question, and then, thoughts behind that too, feedback of what your thoughts are always welcome.
Yeah. Thanks. That's helpful. I guess I asked because on the one hand, I certainly see the interest in talking about the trend in, acres burned. And yet I think you also acknowledge in your presentation that, some of these systems depend on fire. And so the long-term goal of getting landscapes to a place where they're more resilient and resistant to natural disturbance processes, so that we can facilitate, sort of reintroduction and ability to live with those fire regimes, for example, to sustain a healthy forest, healthy landscapes. It speaks to this conundrum, the paradox that we're in around fire, where it's not quite so simple to say, oh, look at this trend about increasing acres burned. Isn't that scary if we can't differentiate within that the type of fire that's burning? And the severity of those fire. You hit on the fact that we're seeing increasingly severe fire, but those graphs don't communicate that because they're purely around acres burned. So if there's a way to, include something in that, so that we're not implying that all of that fire is actually bad, that some of it's actually restoring, I think that'll go a long ways towards reinforcing this narrative that fire isn't necessarily strictly a bad thing always.
Yeah, thank you for that, Pete. Carl, I see your hand raised as well.
I just gotta say, it seems like your stats on suppression costs would reflect that. You may have a similar acres burned, but your suppression costs would go down if you do as Pete is suggesting.
Yeah, going back to these two. Any other thoughts or comments on that? I really appreciate you bringing that up, Pete.
I just think as we're communicating to some of the not only economic costs, but some of the social, environmental justice impacts, et cetera, like broadly speaking, there's, if we're trying to communicate the importance of this shift in our thinking and trying to restore ecosystems, that we don't necessarily only have to live with the most extreme and severe wildfire. There's just a broad suite of social, cultural, economic, ecological benefits to that change. And I think some more nuance to these graphics could help tell that story. So sorry, I'm using the soapbox overly, but here.
I guess the question, Pete, too, is do you have something that displays that? Do you have a graph or a way of displaying that?
I'll think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that question as well, because it's a really important issue and sort of messaging, and I haven't yet found like the perfect way to do so. I'm sort of curious if anybody has seen good examples that maybe could inspire our thinking a little bit more as well about how to address both the cost aspect, but also the kind of like the living with fire and the like, not all fire is bad kind of thing, So I've never really seen a good portrayal of that in documents I've read. Lots of words, but not really good kind of simple messaging about it.
Yeah, and Amanda, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I guess one thing I think we need to be really careful about is, yes, good fire does come out of, like there can be spots of good fire within large fires that on a whole are bad. And we want to be careful about, to me, any fire during extreme wildfire conditions either is or has the potential to be bad fire, no matter how quote unquote good it is in the beginning. So I think that we need to be really careful with that messaging. I'm not saying that we can't, explain to the public that we can get positive benefits from fire. But, there's always going to be negative externalities associated with fire as it relates to smoke, resource damage, and other things associated with that. So, I just want to be really careful. And then I also wanted to highlight and see if there's anything that ODF can do to pull this together. Associated with this, obviously, there's large suppression costs, the slide that we're on right now. AOL and our members are critical assets in the complete and coordinated system. And our ability to maintain those assets on the landscape is, in our minds, really critical. And developing that narrative around the importance to keep folks employed, to keep contractors, engaged in the state and their businesses running, I think is important on the, not only just for our mitigation efforts and our cleanup efforts, but also during fire. So if ODF has the ability to pull in some stats on like signed IRAs or, pieces of equipment that are registered with the department for initial attack and during wildfire season, that might be a really interesting piece of the puzzle to highlight and sort of weave that story about not only fire during fire season, but also the mitigation side. And, obviously we're just very integrated with that workforce piece. So tying the two together, I think could be a really important narrative as well, and just a good piece of data.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that. And I'm seeing hands raised, I think Joseph and then Oriana. So go ahead, Joseph.
Oh, just on this one note real quick, it might be interesting to see severity in this graph. I know that might be hard to do with, and not all high severity fire is bad. I don't mean that either. But I just think, a big chunk of those bars are low severity fire, and that might be at least interesting to add and have some nuance on the bar graph. But what I was wondering was about back to the big overall flow chart of the entire strategy. I don't know if we can look at that slide. I just was curious because it was something I was wondering about is as we develop this 20-year plan, I think it's back one more where you have the whole flow. Mega, there you go. So regional stakeholder engagement. Yeah. So like identify regional needs, barriers, solution, priorities. That when I was looking at the outline for the strategy, I wondered where that really fit, because it sure seems like we can do all this great work and identify all these priority areas and say exactly what we need to do, but then we realize like, oh gosh, we just said we should do all this prescribed fire, and like we can't because the laws don't let us, or whatever, right? So is that, I don't really see that in the, I just want to make sure I understood that actually is going to be developed within the strategy where we identify those barriers, those obstacles to actually getting the work done.
Yeah, I'll hit on that. So that's kind of the, one of the ideas of the strategy and the regional engagement. There's a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers at local level. And how does that, along with sovereign nations, the tribal engagements, the work that y'all are doing at state level, how does that all filter up into this agency coordination implementation group and really having those conversations and really kind of working on solutions and what are the barriers that we're seeing within one region and what are we seeing throughout the whole state? And then really over the next 20 years, those are the barriers that we should really be working on overcoming. And that's also where we have kind of the support mechanisms and that scientific and resource assessment team putting that together. And how can we have these big challenging issues and start to work on those and using our resources and using this governance to really work on those and also work with our strategic leadership group as well. So I think that's the hope, right, is to get those barriers, bring them up, work through this mechanism and hopefully try to overcome them. It's one of the overall objectives, and definitely hear you how to weave that into the written documents, weave that into all those aspects. So Joseph, hopefully that helps provide some context, or if you have some additional thoughts to that too, would love to hear, or any others of how should that system be working. That's the way we've been viewing it.
No, that's helpful. I know we've been really focused in on the prioritization, which makes a lot of sense. It's important. When I went back and looked at the draft outline of the plan, I had a hard time thinking about where that fit in your outline. That's all.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's really good feedback. Appreciate that. Oriana?
Yeah, I thought that kind of came out of what both Pete and Amanda said, which is I think the limit sometimes of showing information through graphs and through kind of hard data and numbers. There is a narrative component to this work. And there is like a storytelling component of this work to start to get into like fluffy, touchy-feely territory a little bit. But I think that's important as part of this as well, is like actual photographs of what like a portion of a fire where there has been a healthy recovery or that fire was beneficial are impactful, just as our photographs of a forest that has not recovered well, or an area of a forest that has not recovered well. And similarly, stories of workers who have been impacted or communities that have been impacted, I think are an important piece of this. And then I'll just end by asking a question, which is, what do you see as the role of like the local ODF offices, especially in the state stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, let me start with the first one. I answer the question. Definitely hear you about photos, and I also ask if y'all have key photos that you can send. I think that would be really important as well. You know, I've gathered photos over the last year, but if y'all have some that you think are of value, kind of put those into a database, because we are looking at getting it from a report into a final written document that has the story and has the photos, et cetera. So I just want to throw that out there. If you do have some, please send them to me. I could definitely use that. Going into the ODF offices at the, I think you asked about the state stakeholder level, is that right?
Yeah, or kind of taking that state stakeholder engagement or into local engagement, and what is the role, maybe rather than like community-based organizations, of some of the folks on the ground working with workers who are in the forests and people who are recreating in the forests, and really engaging with communities from within the department.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking I understand the question. So a couple thoughts here. One of them being, within the regional stakeholder engagements, especially through the partnerships and collaboratives, the ODF offices and all the agencies, should they be, but really the hope that they're working with and engaging within all those different collaboratives and partnerships. So that's kind of one aspect, having that perspective. And then also within our agency coordination, we have the agencies that are representing the agencies, but each one of those agencies should be working with their agencies on different aspects of the strategy and how to integrate it into the programs, integrate it into the offices, and really our daily business, right? So, this is that shared stewardship approach where we're all getting together, but outside of that, having the agencies really integrated into the overall body of the work that we do. So I don't know if I hit your question specifically, but just how this should be really flowing through all the agencies, et cetera.
I mean, we could also put a plug in there. If it was our ideal, we would also have an equity, engagement group on this, and we've done that outreach. And if there's anyone here that has the capacity or to strategize or point us to a community-based local group that we want to engage that. And we've done the outreach, we just haven't had the capacity received to do that. And our next step forward is taking a proposal to the Environmental Justice Council. And so that is still effort that is too little and too late, but we are still looking for it.
Any other, those are great questions and great thoughts. I'd also open it up if there's any responses or additional thoughts behind that. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is gather kind of input on all these aspects. So any other questions, thoughts on this? All right, thank you. I really appreciate all that. I'm going to jump into the next piece, because the next one we want to jump in is to the prioritization, kind of where we've landed. So just kind of a recap on some of the products here. So looking at getting to those short-term priority geographies for treatments. With starting off with the overall wildfire risk of the quantitative wildfire risk assessment, and looking at those 4 highest ENVC classes. And having that help guide us to where are those areas, along with the landscape health priorities and the different aspects that have gone into that landscape health priorities. And a reminder in previous meetings and in previous slides, how that information, how those maps look throughout the states, which really helped us guide us into where we're looking at to really start prioritizing short term. So really starting off, if you look at the top 4 ENVC classes and the top 15% of the landscape health priorities, where those really look at, and then some feedback from other meetings as well, looking at removing in some of these areas, the wilderness areas, the areas of exclusion, and then also the urban growth boundaries within this. So kind of an overall, how do you look at the big picture? And really over the next 20 years, those top highest of the highest is what the models are currently saying, understanding that those will shift over the next 20 years as well. And that's at 28 million acres and the breakup of that. And what we had talked about in previous meetings, advance us. There we go. So then honing that in to looking at where our short-term priorities of really where starting or continuing the work that's currently going and within those short-term priority geographies, and what is the breakup of that land, the ownership within these areas, and then the overall within this geographic area, 18.7 million acres within these priority areas here. And so I just wanted to kind of point out, this is where we landed last time, the continuing conversations, working with the different local resources, et cetera, to continue to dive deeper into some of these areas. But also wanted to kind of bring some new data that looking into it, looking at what is our readiness and our capacity. One of them being the BLM NEPA plan areas. Where is NEPA plans or within some kind of process within NEPA? So having that data to help us inform within these areas, where are we ready? Where do we need to start looking at areas for planning and capacity building as well? So once again, looking at U.S. Forest Service NEPA project areas as well. So just wanted to bring that data in to kind of look at these maps on top of all the maps that we've looked at in the past. And then also milling infrastructure. Where's our current milling infrastructure? There's been discussions about doing all this work. Do we have the infrastructure to do it, and how ready are we for that? So you can see some information we were able to obtain from the Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and where are the active, closed, and inactive. And once again, I believe this data is from 2017 or later, and they're kind of doing a new study on that. But just kind of an idea of where is our infrastructure within these areas, and how does that help us inform future infrastructure in order to do this work. So really looking at what is our overall milling infrastructure, and then also collective action groups. We've, as a reminder, in the past meetings, we talked about the QCA, qualitative capacity assessments, sent out to 33 groups and got response from 28 of them, of the partnerships and collaboratives throughout the state. And one of the requests was to have an updated idea of where these groups are active within the state. And this is a mapping of where they are and where are these areas work, or where are these groups working. So this is an overlay, and there are some areas where there is one all lands partnership working, and there are other areas where there are multiple all lands partnerships and collaboratives working. So this data, once again, is helping us inform our regional engagements, who we're working with within those partnerships and collaboratives, but also where's that coverage, and where are the current efforts within treatments, the local prioritization, et cetera. So just wanted to pull out this data that we have been able to put together, looking at where are those collective action groups. And then the last piece of that too is, so we look at where are these high level geographic areas, but then here are within those collective action groups, kind of 7 different groupings that we put together to have more focused, in-depth conversations with the regional groups, and broke it up into 7 to really dive deeper with these groups to understand different aspects of the strategy. And go ahead and pull my notes up here. So with that too, kind of display here is the regional engagement, and really the purpose of that regional engagement is a couple different points here. One of them being the geographic prioritization. So working with those local groups to kind of get that on the ground knowledge of are these the areas, where are these groups prioritizing, where is the work currently occurring, where is it being planned, et cetera, to really understand going from this high state level to that local level, to really make sure there's alignment with what we're looking at here and what those local groups are looking at. So that's one of them, and looking forward to having those conversations with folks on the grounds. And then also follow up from that QCA, that capacity assessments. That was a high level, self-reported, and continuing that conversation of what are those capacity needs, what are those barriers, and once again, how does that filter up and at a state level through that governance? What are the things that we can easily tackle, and what are some of the big challenges that we need to be working on over the next 20 years? And we've identified that in this group and in other groups, and weaving that into the strategy, but want to continue understanding that. And then the last one is kind of continuing dialogue, and really interested within these local partnerships and collaboratives of what do they see as the benefit of continuing the engagement over the 20 years within the implementation of the strategy. And really, once again, building that really strong engagements as we get into these pieces, and as we really get into implementation, looking at these priority geographies and the goals that we're trying to achieve, et cetera. So, and then I just wanted to express kind of for information for this group, we're talking to the Klamath area this week, and then we have plans to talk to North Central April 6th, and then have some scheduling that we're looking for April 13th, April 3rd to the 14th, of working with the other 5 groups as well. So really in April, planning on bringing a lot of this information to those groups, gathering information to help us kind of wrap up the report by June. So that regional engagement is really starting to take off. So wanted to throw that out there. So once again, I'm going to pause there, talk about some of these maps that we've seen, questions, comments, and then also does it feel right? Is this this is where we landed last time, and just wanted to kind of pause there, and questions, comments, and then we'll kind of jump into the other parts of it. So yeah, any questions, comments? Megan, do you mind? Oriana?
Yeah, does your mill map include some of the planned work, like say that the Port of Portland is doing around the CLT facility?
I don't think it gets that specific, but I definitely know having those conversations with ODF, who's heavily involved in that, and that's where moving into implementation as well is, how can we look at that same thought process, or looking at new infrastructure or new product development within other areas, and hopefully that this prioritization will help us. So specifically, no, but I believe that some of these mill locations that are involved in that are plotted on here. Susan Jane?
Thanks. So I didn't hear you talk about the wildfire hazard map. And so I'm wondering if that was intentional or perhaps an oversight. And a related question, I heard on one of the maps, you were talking about excluding the urban growth boundary as a place for potential treatments, which may be inconsistent in terms of wanting to make sure that we create defensible space around communities. Urban growth boundary may be exactly the right spot. So if you could talk a little bit more about those two things, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the high and extreme risk WUIs. We talked about that last meeting. I didn't want to re-show all the maps, but as a reminder that we made sure that a lot of these lines in kind of where these priorities were around those high and extreme risk WUI areas. So that is reflected within what are these priority geographies. And that's in previous slides from last meeting that you could always go back and check on. So absolutely in consideration. And then once again, going to the urban growth boundaries, really the idea here is going to the beginning slide. This is about the landscape resiliency aspect. So yes, we want to work around those urban growth boundaries, but we also want to partner with the folks who are working on the fire adapted communities aspect of it. And one of them being, having conversations with OSFM about how these strategies and how this is really focused on landscape resiliency, but we need to build strategies within fire adapted communities and safe and effective fire response as well. So that was kind of the idea behind it, is that the strategy isn't going to be doing defensible space, home hardening, ingress, egress within those areas, but we really need to be working strategically around them and working really close with that aspect of it. So hopefully that answers the question, and any follow up on that too. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. And I apologize. I see Amanda and Joseph. And Amanda, you're up top. I don't know who is first, so Amanda, I'll go ahead and call you out there.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Oriana's comment really quick on the map that we see right now with milling infrastructure. And I think we need to be careful with this, because I imagine, based on the quantity of green triangles, that it includes secondary or tertiary infrastructure. And we need to recognize that that infrastructure cannot exist without primary infrastructure. So I don't know if we want to just look at primary milling infrastructure, or if we really want to look at everything. I think it's more useful to focus on primary milling infrastructure as it relates to the supply chain. I think that we can talk about, that secondary or tertiary as well. But again, our ability to get things milled and get things out of the woods really relies primarily on that first, mill that the products run through with the raw materials. So just want to, I don't feel too strongly about that. But I think that narrative piece, I think it's important to differentiate.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. Joseph?
I was curious about the NEPA map. And it's kind of related to the other one before that. I was just surprised that it's huge NEPA areas. Are those surprising? Clearly that's BLM land is in a checkerboard. I can't imagine that yellow. I don't know what that is, but I was also thinking, though, we always do these things where we're sort of starting from scratch and nothing's ever happened up to this point. So I was wondering about all the projects that have happened. Could we map those too? Because we're not really starting from scratch. There's been a lot of stuff done. I always think about the Ashland watershed. It's we've never done anything there, even though we've treated half of it. And so what do you think about that? It's also because we can build on a lot of those projects that have happened, and we should be doing that over time.
Yeah, no, that's great. So a couple of things, just once again, a reminder, last meeting slides we had pulled in and helping inform a lot of this is where's the current priorities and where's a lot of the current projects and the funding at a state level going. So we brought in all the data from the different agencies and overlaid that. So we do have that information. And then also, these are big, really high level, and how do we drill down into, as we get into that regional and local, and really understanding within these, where are those priorities, where has work been occurring, how do we continue that work, and then also essentially looking at where do we need to get to, where are we currently at, and where's that gap in between, and how are we helping fill that gap in between. So and I'll also say, one of the things that we're looking at through decision support and accomplishment tracking and dashboard is finding a shared stewardship approach to gathering all that information. There is a lot of information out there, but there's not one centralized way of collecting it and not truly understanding exactly where we've been doing work, how much, for how long. And it's a big challenge, information we're trying to gather that is really hard to get. And that's where the strategy is hoping to help solve that and starting to pull all that information in one collective way. So hopefully that kind of helps, kind of that two different levels of thinking of it, but recognizing and working off of the work that's happening on the ground, I think is extremely important. Sean, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in on the NEPA. I haven't seen this data layer, but I assume it has to do with the BLM's Western Oregon plan revision they did a few years ago, and they got a programmatic NEPA clearance on that.
No, that's not what this is.
No? Okay.
No. It's a good guess though, but it's not because it doesn't cover all of Western Oregon. And it's only programmatic NEPA for their resource management plan, not actual ground disturbing activity. Unless this is IVM and 126 together, Joseph, you might know.
That's what I think it is. I think it's IVM, which is, very conditional based management.
Yeah. And 126 is in court.
Yeah. It just, it over represents, I think what, that landscape is all like ready to go from a NEPA perspective. That's not really what's going on there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, there are other questions, comments on kind of this information that we have right now? Pete?
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to ask the question because I realized I was gone last meeting and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't had a chance to go back and watch. So forgive me in advance if I ask something dumb. So I guess I'm taking away from this map that these gray areas, and maybe can we go back to the slide that just sort of initially shows I think it was 18.7 million acres.
Going back. Right here?
Yeah. So I guess, is that to imply then that the 20-year landscape resilience strategy is effectively prioritizing all 18.7 million acres equally?
Is it prioritizing it equally? Well, a couple thoughts about this. One of them being, so that's just representing where are these areas? That is the total acreage. And then understanding that these are, really derived from Huck 10 watersheds at a really high level, et cetera. So it's just to kind of give us like an idea of like, how many acres are we looking at here?
Yep.
There are areas in here that, are not areas that work is going to occur. That may be, agricultural fields or other areas. And that's where really wanting to working with the regional folks, starting to get a better understanding of where are those priorities on the landscape at that local level occurring now, and where is it moving into the future, and really diving deeper into that. But it's just a general idea when we say, yeah, these are the areas that we really want to focus in. How many acres is that as a whole, to give us an idea, and what is the breakdown of that? Who owns all of that land?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Really, really high level.
Yeah. And I mean, I tend to agree that given the coarseness of the data, that's probably appropriate. And the reason I ask is because it definitely pushes some very important work out into the future with the I don't know what we're going to call it, the local landscape, the regional landscape prioritization process, or landscape, like DNR calls it their landscape evaluation process. But it's taking that next finer scale set of data and priority treatment areas from, local groups, whether that's a shared stewardship partnership or a forest collaborative or whatever, and using that finer scale phase 2, tier 2, whatever you're going to call it, process to identify within this. Because I guess, again, like I'm just asking myself the question, is this going to check the box from the legislature's perspective that we've identified the highest priority places in Oregon now to go out and work on increasing landscape resilience, if it's just a map that sort of shows writ large a big mask of 18.7 million acres that is, has this overlay of high wildfire risk, high insect and disease, absolute change in climate water deficit, I'm forgetting restoration need, and sage step ecological integrity or whatever, and this is it, then we just need to be clear then that there's, I guess, a whole nother step in the prioritization process. Again, I'm an advocate for this finer scale landscape evaluation. I have been from the beginning, but we should probably be pretty clear that that's got to still come before we get to that we're sort of ready to say, hey, these are the places where local landscapes are ready, they have the capacity, they've identified their priority areas, and this is the work to be done.
Yep. No, it's really good. I really appreciate that, Pete. And I will say that is here pretty soon, as we start getting into really some of the meat of the strategy, is starting from feedback we've been hearing from y'all and others, starting to incorporate that into the strategy, that we really want to start diving into those local landscape evaluations and understanding that at a much finer scale, and how does the strategy support that and really bring it up, all of these different areas that are doing that, and really bring that up to an overall comprehensive view at a state scale. So yeah, really appreciate that. Joseph?
No, Pete, I was at the last meeting. I thought it was a good question. I didn't know the answer. That's good. And so that's why I was wondering about like the chloropleth maps, with the hazards and the different things, if that would then further prioritize within this 18.7 million acres, or is that just to inform the black outline? Because I thought that you could prioritize based on those watershed scale maps, right? Is that not further prioritization within the 18.7?
So I think take
a look at the wildfire risk level.
The QWRA, the overall QWRA.
Yeah, all of the prioritization maps, are they not sort of like a menu to decide? Okay, this priority area, this is a higher rating within this 18.7 million acres.
The way that we've always been viewing this is, looking at those highest of the high areas, it helps identify where are the areas that we really want to focus into, right? So that's what this does. It gives us this like kind of high level, this is where we want to focus, and then digging into deeper analysis. And once again, looking at deeper analysis at that local level, and working with those local groups to really dive into that, right? Local perspective, et cetera. The other thing is, as a reminder, we're looking at short-term priorities of where do we start focusing, and then also the development of decision support. And that's where, Sean's on the call and been in all these meetings, and really helping us think about that and developing that for, still working through this to help out with localized prioritization and then future statewide prioritization within these different aspects. And how does that also feed into the accomplishment tracking? We talked about that. How do we know we're doing the treatments, the acreage that we're getting on the grounds, and that should all feed into one overall interactive.
That makes sense. I guess what I'm saying is that this prioritization, when it comes out in this 20-year plan, it will just have this map. It won't say, oh, here's the WUI, that might be a higher priority within the 18.7, or here's the high fire risk watersheds, those might be a higher priority within this 18.7. Those just information to inform at a local level at some later date that some other people decide. All we're saying is this is a priority landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's hopefully, as we kind of jump in the next couple sections, that'll help inform some of it too. And really these are looking at where are these big areas that the agencies want to really coordinate the investments. Where do we really want to look at building capacity within these areas. And then one of those aspects is then looking more at that localized prioritization and really supporting that prioritization. So yes, it's just looking at like high level, where do we want to focus short term is really the idea behind this.
Sorry, can I ask another question? Because I feel like I feel like I'm dominating the airspace. So
yeah, please ask away.
Okay, so just to understand then again what's depicted here, and I don't know if this is best directed at Sean or you, Nathan, but so the mask here, this 18.7 million acres, is this a place where, as I sort of listed it, wrote it down, and it's on your slide, maybe it's the 2 or 3 before this. So this is QWRA, National Insect and Disease Inventory. Okay, yeah, here we go. So it's essentially there's five data sets here. Is that correct? And is that map showing where, I mean, is that map, that mask of 18.7, is that anywhere that any one of these even alone is present, or are those 18.7 where well, it can't be all 5 of these because sagebrush and forest disturbance wouldn't be coincident data sets, but yeah, help me understand what's depicted here. Is how many of those data sets have to be in over 1 pixel necessarily to show up in this map? Can it be just one of them?
Yeah, so this is looking at the top 4 ENVC classes depicted, and then the top 15% of the landscape health priorities, that aspect of it. And then within the last meeting, we had showed and previously talked about where all the areas that our current investments are going, where within the different agencies. So then it's built around where are all of those areas that work is currently happening on the ground, or those current priorities. And then once again, looking at where the short-term priorities, where are the initial areas that we want to start and we really want to start focusing in on. Do you want to add in?
Yeah, can you go back up 1 slide? 2 slides, one more slide. Yeah, there. Okay. So essentially, I think what he's asking there is like, there's an additive aspect. There's the top 4 ENVC classes. And so the total includes all of those. And then there's a second additive piece, which is the combination of those next 4 things, which then becomes the landscape health priorities. And we took the top 15% of that, and that became the short-term priority geographies. And that's the next slide down.
Yep.
Okay, so
that shows that, but now there's another step, which is consulting with local experts on the ground about looking at what are the priorities from their perspective, and others that we've, not just on the ground, but from the academics and others we've been talking with, to kind of narrow in on the near term versus the longer term.
And then on top of where the current investments and the current priorities, so IIJA, Bill, CFLR, Joint Chiefs, LRP, some of those, and then also a reminder, looking at areas with high and extreme WUI risk, adding, helping mold with some of those areas. So it was like Dan saying, there's that second aspect of it, of all those maps that we showed last time that helped us inform kind of continuing where these initial focus areas are. And then really the objective here is with the regional engagement, like I had looked at with those 7 groups, and then starting to really dig in where within those local groups are those priorities, what type of prioritization has been done, and where are you looking at doing that work in the next 5 years, and really an understanding of where are the areas that truly know that, and where are the areas that need help to understand where those priorities are over the next 5 years. So once again, short-term priorities. Pete, does that kind of help provide some clarity? And I see Carl's up, but I just want to make sure that we're answering the question, and then any other kind of thoughts you have behind it too are really important.
Yeah, let me chew on it. But I think I understand that the map is, it basically takes the landscape health, which I appreciate that. So that goes in, becomes its own, like a a sort of a binned metric in and of itself. And then you took the top 15% of that, overlaid it with the 4 highest risk classes. And it's those two things together that represent the 18.7 million acres with the additional refinements of all those other factors that you took into consideration.
What I would propose too, we put all the slides on the webpage. You can even jump on it right now and look at the last DEX meeting, and we kind of laid out all those slides and kind of how they got there. So what we didn't want to do was show 15, 20 slides this time, but I'd recommend looking at that, and that can kind of inform like, how did we get here?
But I also would say, to your question, is like, I think we need to be very clear about the process that we used and kind of map that out. That's something we haven't, we've done in lots of words just now, but we haven't done it in clarity on the screen. And I think we need to do that. So thanks for that.
Yeah, Carl.
Yeah, I know you're gonna, and I appreciate the explanation and the questions that kind of helped inform what this map is showing. I just know for the region or the area I'm really familiar in and working in, that all the work that we're currently investing in and doing is outside of these boundaries. And these boundaries, basically in the area I'm working in, is all Forest Service. So I would wonder if, especially in the 2020 fire footprints, where there is a lot of investment currently being pushed to those areas, that as you start to talk to local regional priorities, those are going to be priority areas around those communities that got burned and now are trying to recover.
Yeah,
so I don't know, are you saying that, moving forward, if we're outside of this boundary, the work we're doing is not meaningless, but isn't going to really fit the strategy as you're developing it?
Yeah, I think that's something really important to know. It's not saying that there aren't other priority areas or high risk areas. This is really looking at, according to the data that we had put together, in short term, where are we looking at the highest of the high, and really the idea is where do we really want to place those coordinated investments and those coordinated actions amongst the multi-agencies that are invested in the strategy. And I think that's why it's really important to note too, of kind of the land ownership of the areas that we can really work together to make an impact collectively through shared stewardship. And what it doesn't mean is work that's happening outside isn't important. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing that work. It's just through this strategy, these are the areas that we really want to coordinate. And then once again, we need to have deeper conversations and understand with those local resources, where is that work occurring? We don't have all that data. We don't have all that information. And that's really the idea of these regional engagement conversations that we're setting up, is saying, here's what we have. What do you have? Where are you working? How do we start molding these together and making sure that we're in alignment, because the wheels are in motion in a lot of places. And we want to make sure that we're supporting that. And then over the next 20 years, continuing to work together. And that's that continual engagement, continual tools that we're looking at putting together to understand that, to collectively in alignment be working, in high priority areas together. So there's a lot more work to do, but this is definitely a good start to really focus us and dive in. So, but thank you for that, Carl. Hopefully that looks like thumbs up answers the question. Joseph?
Just real quick. I appreciate that. I still have this concern about a ton of wilderness being on this map. And it looks like maybe you're depicting inventoried roadless areas now. Not that they won't burn or to say anything about the hazards there, but just, in a strategy that is like, we're going to direct resources here. It seems like we have a lot of places where they're completely non-operable. I think you've captured on the crest of the Cascades in particular, quite a bit of that land. Whereas, what Carl just said, you didn't, maybe get some of the land that's a little closer to where there's actually stuff going on. Just a note that, not saying it's, I think have you mapped that now, Nate? Is that what those like little brown things are in there? Inventoried roadless areas or something?
Yeah, so from the last conversation we had, Mirka did take the data that she had and removed what was the wilderness. So I think the wilderness and inventory roadless areas. Okay. if not, then we're missing some data then to help us understand that. And that was the idea too, is as we get into that 18.7 million acres, where are the areas we know we're not working? So I guess the question, I've seen some head shaking, so maybe we didn't capture that adequately, and we need to relook at the data to make sure we're moving all the wilderness areas. Is that correct?
I think I see inventoried roadless areas and so that those are supposed to be exclusions, or what is that? Is it just mapping the? We could sidebar this, but I see wilderness just showing up as federal U.S. Forest Service land, green.
Yeah, I concur. I'm seeing that as well.
Okay, really good feedback. Really appreciate that.
We'll look into that.
No, great conversation. I think just to kind of round this off, and then Amanda, I'll call you here in a second. To round it off too, is once again, like, this is like high level, like focus. There are a lot of places in here, and I appreciate you saying, you know, areas that are inaccessible or areas that we can't or shouldn't be going into, et cetera, right? We're really hoping that local assessments are identifying and understanding those areas. And that's why, you know, we don't have, this isn't every piece of it. It's really looking at where the focus areas are and where we really want to start moving into. So Amanda.
Yeah, I guess for the 18.7 million acres, I recognize that those areas are off limits on U.S. Forest Service lands for active management. Does that 18.7, is that reflective of the need for treatment? And then we could, tie that within a narrative to the barriers for treatment, in that those areas are off limits. They would potentially benefit from restorative treatments, but cannot due to land designation. I just want to make sure, like, if the 18.7 is to identify the needed, the lands at risk or whatever, I think that's fine, but tying that to the barrier would be useful.
Yeah, and once again, the 18.7 is just the areas that are circled right here. And that's what that number is, just to give us an idea of like, what is this? Once again, there are areas that work won't occur, and we haven't pulled or chopped all those out. And then also the conversation of we probably won't treat every acre, and looking at some different information, different reports, anywhere from 35 to 45% of that. So do you take 35 to 45% of that 18 million to really hone into what are the overall acres that need to be treated within this map? So I don't want to get too hung up on that. Really, the idea was just to say, like, of this areas that are circled, that equals 18 million total acres.
I think that's also appropriate given the coarseness again of the data, that the input data here. You can't, with any of those, like, let's just take the QWRA, that's a summed value at the HUC 10 scale. It isn't saying where within that HUC 10 that any particular HVRA that has ENVC, an expected net value change of X, where that exists in there. And so to say that, oh, this occurs within whatever designation of a forest management plan or within this administrative designation of a wilderness or inventory, you can't really say where those exist with coarseness of the scale or coarseness of the data. So I don't know that it would be appropriate necessarily to sort of quote unquote link it back to barriers, Amanda, because you can't really say that barrier is why you can't treat in this particular area when you're not even saying at this scale that's where you would go treat anyway. I think, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but.
All right. It's been a very good conversation and some really good feedback. And it sounds like, providing some more clarity and really mapping out the process of how we get here. And really what this is telling us is what I'm hearing, and some other really good feedback as well. So I am going to kind of call one last question. Otherwise, I'm going to move us on because we do have quite a bit more to chat about. Amanda, did I see your hand raised again?
Yeah, just really quick. And I might have missed this earlier, but for the private, were you just going to keep that as private, or was that going to be separated out at all? Because that's, there's probably a lot of different pieces in that, whether it's industrial lands, small woodlands, if it's other, I don't know. That might need to get separated out.
Okay.
Do we have that data?
I don't know if we have that data at this level, but it's something I could definitely look into to see, how we can parse that out into individual pieces. I definitely understand what you're saying, but let me see if we have that data. Unless Amanda, once again, if you have a data set that we could use to look at that, would be really helpful as well. So.
Yeah, I can see. I think that you guys would have that somewhere, but yeah.
Would you think the distinction is between sort of large industrial versus not, or is there other distinctions that are important to consider in this?
Yeah, I mean, there might be others that people think of. I think that's the one that sticks out to me right away as we think about what is possible or not possible on different lands, and how different scales of land ownership may have different desired future conditions or reasons to be treating their land, or how they view their asset. So, I think that would be good to know how much is captured within this 18.7 million acres.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking, I don't know how big some of these land holdings are, but at this scale of sort of the landscape, maybe here's a question, is that better captured in the sort of local planning level rather than at this sort of large landscape level?
I'll answer that unless somebody else has an answer. I mean, if we're going to be including, the less than 1% of local governments, I would say that this is probably going to be more than that. So I would think that it would be important.
Got it. Okay.
I do know that ODF keeps those data. So you should have it in terms of the small forest landowners, 5,000 acres, collective ownership and less, and then greater than 5,000 acres being industrial. But, along those lines, as we were talking, I'm just wondering about then, should we also differentiate maybe like how much of this federal land is in the categories that were called out in the legislation, specifically, wilderness, and I think there was late successional reserves, those sorts of things. Like, would that make sense here, and maybe clarify, that we're not talking about logging the wilderness areas or something, or just people kind of not realizing that, yeah, we know this is a big swath of land, and there's some considerations before we start implementing treatments across all of it. And Nate, maybe you could speak to that, because I do know the legislation called out some different land use and land use allocations, right?
I believe so, and I believe that we had looked at all those points, and I also know the Governor's Wildfire Council, there had been work done with those individual land classifications. So I'll definitely look into that a little bit deeper and work with Mirica to see how much more we can really parse that out, which data she has, and then how to obtain this data. So yeah, I'll definitely dig into that a little bit deeper. Excellent. It's been really good. Really appreciate the feedback. We got some good notes here. So I am going to propose to move on because we have a lot more information that hopefully will provide some clarity as well. But before we do have a break on the agenda for 10 minutes. So I'd propose that we take that break and then we can power through the last hour and a half and kind of jump into the next part of the overall agenda. So right now it's 3:25, so I'd say at 3:35, let's go ahead and jump cameras back on and we'll jump into it. So really appreciate everything and take a breather and maybe step outside for a second, enjoy the snow. So we'll talk to you real soon. Second part of the conversation, and then I'll go ahead and wrap us up, before 5 and get us out of here. So with that, Dan, I'll go ahead and pass it to you, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you. So what I want to do is, so far we've really been focusing in on the first, sort of 3 or 4 things we've been doing up till now, and we're really trying to work into making the decisions around priority geographies. Once we've done that, then we want to move into this question of all right, what are we going to do, the SMART goals, and how are we going to pay for it, and how are we going to monitor it? And so we're starting down that road, and wanted to show you what we're thinking with, again, the idea that we want your feedback and help us get it better. And it doesn't move. All right, there we go. You start recording. Yeah. So SMART goals, these really have a big influence in terms of how we sort of think about the implementation plan, the financial plan, and also the metrics, because the SMART goals will really define the metrics and therefore the accountability piece. And then all that information is going to be fed back into the decision support so that we can refine these goals over time, because we will probably need to. So you've seen this before: SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time bound. And they basically are an attempt to say what needs to be accomplished and also what kind of milestones along the way do we want to achieve, and basically specifying what we want to do, how much of it, and by when. So some examples of what that looks like. X million acres returned to resilient conditions by 2043 in 20 years. And maybe Y million acres in the priority geographies return to resilient conditions by 2026, the first 3 years. Sort of a lesser amount during the first 3 years, but overall sort of the big picture. And then maybe from a capacity readiness perspective, DEPA maybe we've identified and have prioritized all the appropriate places where it needs to be done by 2028, the first 5 years. So those are examples of what they might look like. These are not necessarily them. We haven't really confirmed any of these yet. But what we want to do is start thinking about, first of all, what categories of goals do we want to set? And so we started thinking about this from the point of view of governance and coordination, capacity and readiness, funding, tracking and accountability, communication and engagement. And then we sort of thought those are sort of process-oriented things. And then we started thinking about, what is it we really want to achieve here? And so landscape conditions, catastrophic wildfires were 2 of those categories. And then we started thinking about the strategic elements as well. And so we have sort of a set of those. And I'll just note that I think today actually a bunch of requests went out for doodles and participation in some of these goal setting processes. And so one of the ways we want to do this is by gathering up people who are sort of focused on those topic areas. For example, outdoor recreation or water management, water and watersheds, or economies or habitat, or equity kinds of things, and sort of bring those people together to help us think through how to think about these things. And so, this is where we're going with those topics. The ones that, the other ones, the governance and the sort of in the blue and the orange there are things that we may or may not need outside experts. This ASIG and us are essentially perhaps capable of dealing with those things. So we're going to start down that path right now and see what thoughts you have, giving you a sense of where we are in our thinking of how we're approaching this and what we've got going at the moment. But again, none of these are final by any means. So the first one I thought we'd start with is landscape condition, in part because it's perhaps one of the more tangible ones. And so the way I've approached this is by thinking about the various components of landscape condition, sort of the forest, health and resilience, sagebrush, range. Each one of those might be a little different, but then you start thinking about that, and then you start thinking about what are the metrics that you want to involve in that. Maybe those differences aren't necessarily as important as they might be in other cases. So, so I thought about the metrics as being sort of percent of acres in a healthy and resilient state. And then another way of thinking about it is acres effectively treated. And those, one of them is sort of an outcome and the other is sort of a process or an activity. So then with that sort of starting point, we came up with a couple of potential goals. So a 20-year goal that 100% of Oregon's landscapes are in a resilient condition by 2043, and a near-term goal that some lesser million acres are priority geographies are effectively treated by 2028, and then increasing as appropriate. So this is a way of sort of saying, here's what we want to do, how much, by when. And we can come, I'll go through a few of these, and we can come back and sort of discuss all of these in any way we want to. Capacity and readiness, just to give you a different flavor of things. The components I thought of were sort of the local groups, agencies, NEPA, local planning, and contractor capacity. Those are some of the things that have sort of popped up as relevant. There may be other things as well that we want to add into this. And then potential metrics, and this doesn't necessarily address all of those components, but sort of the percent of priority geographies capable of implementing treatments. And so, one of the things we've talked about, for example, is that there are some areas in our priority geographies that are ready to go. We can start implementing those areas, and some that are not. They don't have NEPA, they don't have contractors, they don't have agreement. And so if we can sort of identify where those are and aren't, then we can sort of say, these are the areas where we really need to put resources in to get those places to that point of implementing treatments. A second area is percent of priority geographies with local assessments and strategies. That's sort of like a subcategory of the ready to go kind of part is, do they have plans? Do they know what they need to do, where they need to do it? That's probably one of the important things that we want to support with the local groups, is making sure that those plans are done, for those groups that don't have one, supporting that effort so that those groups can define where areas need to be, where the priority areas for treatments are, and that we have agreement on that. We can start working on those areas. Again, NEPA is another example of that. And so, taking those metrics and then turn those into goals. And so, treatments can be implemented in 100% of priority areas in the first, let's say, 15 years. I don't know if that's the right number. Local landscape assessments are initiated by, in all priority areas by the first 5 years. Again, NEPA identified and prioritized. So it's an example of what we're thinking about for capacity and readiness. Governance and coordination, this was a little bit more challenging to be meaningful, I guess. And so this is what we've got so far, but I think we need to do some more thinking, and I'd be interested if you guys have more thoughts as well. So, the components again are the groups and the entities, SLG, tribes, et cetera. And then also projects, cross-boundary multi-agency. And so then the metrics, number of meetings, maybe number of cross-boundary projects that we've initiated. So you can see the goals there. I think we could probably do better, but we haven't done enough thinking around this yet to sort of get something better than what we've got so far. Catastrophic wildfires, again, you've got the components of, large wildfires. You need to define how big a large wildfire is. Structures burned, maybe there are other components we want to think about. So then the metrics, and then again, this is actually, each one of these poses its own little challenge. The right sort of the definition of a goal was, I found, kind of challenging here, and I sort of came up with, because you get every year is going to be different based on conditions and other things. So I sort of thought about it as a downward trend in the number of large wildfires and acres burned and structures burned in the first 10 years, maybe. So that one's a little tougher we don't always have total control over that. So it's a little bit more difficult, but hopefully through the work we're doing, we're actually getting to that point. So anyway, funding again is another one where, you get the components, the metrics was a little challenging, and I think we need more work to think about what that should be. So I haven't even created a goal yet for that. And then tracking and accountability, various components of agency data, landscape change, local groups, financial activity data, and then sort of how to think about that. Potential metrics might be the number of agencies contributing information and the completeness of the data that's provided, and then getting an actual dashboard. Probably we're in the sort of early stages of thinking about some of this stuff, so we haven't really gotten all the way through on this, but you get a sense of like where we're heading on these setting up goals. And what we want to do over the next month or so as we're drafting this, finishing the first draft of this document, is to really flesh these pieces out and connect them to other things that we're doing, and get more specific, but also to discuss this with folks like yourself in the smaller groups to get more insights into how to think about this. So this is my final slide in terms of the goals, before moving on to other pieces. But I wanted to stop here to see what reactions, what thoughts, what help and insights you might be able to provide to help us think through some of these pieces. So welcome any thoughts at all. And Susan Jane, want to go first?
Sure. So I appreciate all of this. I would love to see these slides so that I can look at them and think about them a little bit more. Because there's some that I think make a lot of sense, and then others, as you pointed out, need some work. And sometimes there's just some gaps. And so I'd like to think about it a little bit more. One of the questions that I have, and I've raised this before in other contexts, is, this is we're all gathered here today for a couple of reasons. One, Oregon's shared stewardship agreement with the Forest Service, and also Senate Bill 762, which calls for this kind of plan. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on federal land management, which I, of course, appreciate because that's my area of expertise and focus. But it is supposed to be all lands, as I understand it. And I think that, unless I'm wrong about that, and maybe I am, but if not, then I think keeping that in mind, we're we should craft our goals and our metrics and accountability measures, recognizing that, right? That we may want different things from the federal government than the state government, than private landowners of various stripes, because we've got big timberland owners, small timberland owners, ranchers, like we got different landowners out there. And so I kind of want to think about this piece in light of that. So yeah, not really a question, just kind of a statement. But if I'm wrong about how I'm thinking about this in terms of jurisdiction and how that plays out, please let me know.
No, I mean, the legislation is very clear that it includes private lands. We intend to include private lands in terms of the support for doing this work, and I think private lands are part of the big blobs that we've created in terms of priority geographies. So you're not wrong. You're absolutely right. The question I have at this stage anyway is, because I'm trying to think about like all of these categories and things. I'm just sort of curious, like, how would it be different? Or is there anything that's sort of in your mind now to give understanding that you want to think about this more? And I totally
yeah, totally. I think what really triggered my thinking, which isn't going to be a surprise to most of you, is looking at the slides about NEPA analysis. State of Oregon doesn't have a SEPA. And so how the state manages its lands is different. And so if we're talking about whether the Forest Service and BLM have sufficient NEPA analysis, that's one indicator, but it's not an indicator for the state, for example, or private landowners. So I don't want us to, and again, not a surprise to most people on this call, I am leery of pointing a finger at NEPA as being the cause or a cause for increased wildfire risk, because there is a narrative out there that NEPA, for example, is a barrier to land management. And that's something I disagree with. But if we're only tracking NEPA acres, then that's all people are going to see, right? As opposed to what kind of cross-boundary work are we doing? What kind of work is the state doing on its lands to reduce wildfire risk? Those kinds of questions. So that's why I flagged it, and definitely want to think more about how all that works and how it might play out for each jurisdictional bucket.
Great. Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. Is that Carl on top there?
Yes. Yeah. And I think,
I think John was next, actually.
All right, John.
Yeah, thanks. It seems to me like there's a mathematical exercise that needs to happen to inform the scale of this plan. It would seem like we've got to make some sideboards and, like, say, decide we want in 30 years to have the fuel loads back to a more natural condition, and then you figure out how many acres you have to treat a year to get the fuel loads there, and then you have to figure out, in order to maintain them, you've got to go back in at certain intervals. And I think, hopefully we can do a lot of this with logging, a lot of this with creative low value biofuel stuff. I think fire is going to be a big part of it. I think out on the rangelands where fires are driven by fine fuels, grazing is going to be a part of it. But there's a mathematical exercise that has to go on, because if, like, we run through this planning process and decide we're logging X and we're going to burn Y, and then you do the mathematical exercise and you have to do 5X and 6Y to get there. It seemed like at some point that mathematical exercise has to take place. The other comment I'd make, living in a county of 78% federal land and planning being what it is, I think we can manage federal lands in the presence of NEPA, but it's certainly a barrier to timeliness on treatments. So I think that's fair going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate your comment about the mathematical aspect of this. That's where the priority geographies and the calculation of acres becomes really important, because, you know, if we're shooting for 22 or 18 million acres over 20 years, then we need to figure out what does that mean on an annual basis. And we probably can't, you know, do the average of that in the first year or two. So we're going to have a ramp up. So yeah, so all of that needs to be taken into account. We haven't, that's in part why we haven't done the numbers yet, because we don't have the priority geographies finalized yet.
Well, and even the 18 million acres, that number came from running through the assessment of EVs and 15% of this. I don't think it was ever backwards engineered from arriving at a full treatment of all acres by a given year. So I think there's an additional exercise that needs to take place at some point.
Yeah. There's, I'm not sure if this is what you mean, but you know, there's a theory that, you know, if you need to treat about 40% of a landscape to get it to a resilient state. So if you take, you know, so you have to sort of do all that calculation as well to sort of figure out how much work to be done. I'm not sure where we are on that decision, on that 40% question, but that's also part of what we need to do some more work towards. Carl?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good conversation. I wanted to speak to the landscape conditions that you guys were talking about. And in my mind, there's two kind of things that are, when I think of landscape resiliency and conditions, there's two things that are not part of what you guys are thinking about. And one is kind of the measurement of water on the landscape, because as you know, water helps keep landscapes resilient and also is great for fire breaks and risk reduction and wildfire. So I was wondering if it'd be possible to look at either acres of or changes in acres of, say, you know, water like lakes, wetlands, floodplains, active beaver areas, those kinds of things. That's one thought. The other was kind of development, and development patterns and trends is one that kind of impacts a landscape and actually increases fire risk, or at least the impacts of fire on the landscape. So just throwing that out there, think about.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Amanda.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna continue on with the landscape condition piece there that Carl mentioned. Some of the thoughts that I have on that one, or just to be cognizant of, is, you know, we should probably be looking more at like a rolling average or something like that of landscapes in, you know, a resilient state, or whatever that means, because we have to be okay with some areas not, right? Recognizing how treatment occurs on different landscapes, and that, you know, right after treatment, you might have an increase in fire, you know, impacts because you've got activity fuels on the ground, or, you know, slash that needs to be burned or needs to be removed and hasn't been yet. So, you know, I think thinking about that and having sort of a rolling average would be good, as well as the fact that forests are always growing. There is no end state. It's not like we can just stop doing something and it'll be like that forever. So, you know, we need to probably work that in. And then a question I had on the that piece was, are we going to define resiliency? Like, is that going to be based on ecoregion or stand type or jurisdiction? Because I think that's really important. Is it an age? Is it a average age? Is it a spacing? Is it is it having enough high quality and maintained roads to be able to have good ingress and egress out of a landscape? I mean, I just think that that's really important for that one, and probably something that this group is going to wrestle with for at least a meeting or two. And I can almost guarantee that we're not going to have full consensus on what that means. So, just thinking about that. And then one last thing, and I'll let you respond, either Dan or Nathan, but two things. I do want to recognize, in addition to that, what Susan Jane brought up. I think the jurisdictional boundaries and ownerships, I think that's a really good idea. I was thinking something similar. We probably need to have goals that are specific like that, similar to what I mentioned around ecoregions or stand types, and what resiliency looks like there. I think we need to be heads up about that. And then the last thing is on the funding. Dan, you were having some trouble finding a goal there, but doing something like a goal is having $500 in successful grant procurement by X date, with some component of match or something like that, like something to shoot for, could be a smart goal there. So anyways, I will get off there.
That's great, thank you. And I want to especially go back to the question of defining resilience. I mean, you offered a lot there, so I don't want to diminish any of the other points, but the defining resilience is one that resonates really well for me, because I'm not sure. My guess is that it's going to be different for every type of landscape, and so it's more complicated than a simple definition is probably going to give us in terms of being able to measure it on the ground. And so what you're going to see in one of the slides later today is we've been talking about this science and resource assessment group, Sarah. This is sort of like, helping us with the science questions. And one of the big questions is, I think, how to define resilience and how to measure it. And so I doubt that we're going to actually come up with a workable definition. Maybe we can. I'd love to see it before June, but I think it's something that is worth sort of wrestling with over the course of the next year as we kind of put this together and start thinking about what those words mean, and drawing from the best science around to kind of figure that out. So it's a really important question, and one that it's a big gaping hole for us, I think, at the moment, but I'm not sure how to fill it in the near term. Though I'd love to hear ideas on that if you have them. So, Joseph?
Yeah, some great comments there. I was thinking about just the percentages and how, treatments, maybe you have effectively or something like in strategic, I think comes to mind, but I don't think raw percentages are really that helpful if, you're treating the wrong places, right? So like there's so maybe that's good, but and people have talked about, I would like to sit with these because I do feel I fly a little bit. The governance piece, I was just kind of curious. It seems like, are there new things that we want to suggest here? I'm struck by what California does with their fire safe councils that operate a lot like watershed councils and are really the place and space where there's a lot of cross-boundary coordination happening. Or do you feel like we're just kind of looking at what is existing on the landscape now and working with what we got? Or is this an opportunity to suggest some new things?
This is an opportunity to suggest new things, and I'm all ears. And what was the California group you just mentioned?
Well, they have fire safe councils that are kind of like they're like water councils, in Oregon. There's like that many, and we just don't really have a structure like that here. And we have collaboratives, of course, so maybe those function that way, but they have collaboratives too. But the Fire Safe Council has become a place where there's coordination on treatments across ownership.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is an opportunity to sort of do it right to the best extent possible. So yeah, don't hold back if you've got ideas or models that we should be drawing from. So yeah, I appreciate all of that. I can't read. Is it Oriana? Yeah. Oriana?
Yeah, going back to the landscape conditions slide, I think there's an important element which is missing with regard to tribal governments and communities, and that is the presence of trust resources or first foods or other resources that are really important to tribal governments and tribal communities. And a potential example goal associated with that would be making sure that those resources are preserved and protected.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Carl?
Yeah, it's Joseph kind of triggered some things on the governance thing. I'm wondering, and I don't know how to, because I just scribbled some things down, so I'm not sure how you would map them out as a metric or not. But I'm just thinking of the collaboratives that are in place and the IGAs and MOUs that come out of that. So there's like agreements to essentially share resources and work together. The other is kind of where we have regional coordination organizations in place that are helping coordinate some of this work as well as other stuff. And those areas that have a tribal liaison embedded in their collaborative or in their regional governance structure, somehow tracking that as far as governance. Where local plans kind of wrap into regional or state plans. So, we have these community wildfire protection plans. How do they, or do they relate to the state strategies and priorities? And then the final thing I scribbled down was, again, that state federal coordination, how you measure that as far as G&A activities, or I'm not sure what would be in place there, maybe IGAs, I don't know. Anyway, sorry, it's just a laundry list of stuff that came out when Joseph was talking.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll go ahead and I'm going to start calling them out just to help Dan out here. So Pete, it looks like I have you next.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to, I don't know what number we're at, put a third or a fourth in for wanting to look at the slides and sit with it a little bit more. A lot of thoughts come to mind. Some of the challenges that have already been highlighted around, there's a number of terms throughout some of these metrics that I think need to be defined clearly. And also, I think we need to think about the difference between sort of output-based metrics versus actual outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Both may be appropriate in different cases, but I think in many instances, we're striving for some fairly complex outcomes within complex socio-ecological systems that it's got to make it really hard to come up with some of these very simple metrics or overly simplistic metrics, which, is a perpetual challenge, something we'll have to deal with. But I do worry that, because you see this in the context of other, natural resource management, that overly simplistic goals and metrics and a drive to achieve them can lead you down a path of optimizing for one thing, and it comes at the expense of a bunch of other important things. And I just remind the group and myself that this is the end of the day, the title of this thing is a landscape resilience strategy, which means I just want to be careful that we're not optimizing for one particular value at the expense of the broad suite of values that we care about. With regards to could you go to the fire, what was it? The fire, some of those wildfire metrics, catastrophic wildfires. Yeah, I guess I just want to, I want to put a plug in for the fact that I think we're very wisely using the quantitative wildfire risk assessment here as an input, and we ought to then leverage the quantitative wildfire risk analysis as a metric for evaluating success over time and change in risk. these to me they don't work. The potential metrics here, for me, there's no way that I could say that a large wildfire, just because it passes a size threshold, is not good, and it would meet the definition of, or what is the definition of catastrophic. I think we need to think specifically within different landscapes. What are the values we care about, and those could be identified through engagement with those regional groups, with tribes, socially vulnerable communities, and be really explicit about basing metrics on reduction of risk to the things that we care about. And as we reanalyze or refresh the quantitative wildfire risk assessment, we have the opportunity to look at how that risk profile changes over time and get away from, again, overly simplistic metrics of just the size of a fire or, number of acres burned over time, because that probably isn't going to tell us anything if part of our goal is actually to see more fire on some of these landscapes that are put back in a condition where fire actually is part of sustaining a resilient landscape.
Thank you. That, as I mentioned when I presented this, I struggled with this one, and this is why we do this, so that we could get better information. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Looks like Amanda.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said, Pete, but I might push back a little bit that these probably are things that we should be tracking. Now, how we incorporate that into a narrative or the so what of those metrics, I think, and like into the goals, I think is something different. Because yeah, it's good to track, acres burned. it's not like others aren't tracking that. It's not like we need this plan to necessarily track these things. But I think that these are important metrics for us to recognize. Now, how we develop that into a narrative is different. So I think, I don't know if there's a way to, within the goal, recognize that there should, I know that SMART goals are all about, the metrics, right? That's the M of the SMART goal. But there may be some like qualitative things as well. So I don't know how you build a like qualitative information into a SMART goal, but it might be something for us to think about.
Can I just respond to that quick? I hear ya. Although it does say 5,000 acres. There are some qualitative things in here, right? And I wonder if we're just tracking how acres burned, that's helpful. But how is it burning? Was it burning characteristically within the natural range of variability? Maybe that's like something we could look at, right? Instead of just big fire bad, because that's not always the case. Small fires can be really bad, they're burning down houses.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for making this even more complex for me. I appreciate that.
Looks like,
but I do appreciate it.
Looks like I saw Dave's hand and then John. So Dave.
Okay. I've sat back here listening to this. I think that a lot of the metrics that would be valuable for us to use are, all, as Amanda said, already captured. And it's just a question of how we portray them. A good example would be wildfires versus prescribed fire. That's the first point I'd like to make. One of the other ones is quite, and I bumped into it just the other day. Early on in the conversation today, I thought I heard that this 20-year resiliency project was not going to be working within the wildland urban interface. Did I hear that correctly?
I wouldn't say that it's not working within the wildland urban interface. It's just not focused on, you know, defensible space, home hardening, fire adapted communities, some of that type of stuff, but it has to work very closely with it. So a lot of the, you know, treatment should be targeted around those areas in coordination with the groups that are doing that type of work. So
that was going to
say it's not in the wildland urban. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I was going to point out that particularly in the smaller communities that are in high risk area, that our 20-year Forest Service resiliency projects are important to reducing the threat to the community. And very good examples of that are large NEPA projects around Bend and Sun River. So they're pretty good sized projects, and they're right within the part of the project area is right in within the wildland urban interface. And then the other thought that I had was that, and I deal with this all the time, there is a raft of, if you will, on the shelf Forest Service and BLM NEPA projects in the resiliency field. And they are either, well, they're in process or approved. And early on, I don't think there'll be any difficulty at all finding on the federal ground shelf-ready NEPA. So there you go. And somewhere along the line, I want to reiterate, and again, this is Amanda's area of expertise, but I kind of think that it'll take a while to ramp up just to come up with the contractors to do this work, when at the same time you're in the process of trying to get logs out of the woods and into the mills off both the public and the private ground. So we got to think about our capacity. In some areas, you'd even have to come up with opening up a mill to get the work done. Good example would be Wallowa County. So that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And John?
Yeah, just a comment about fire size. On any given fire, there might or might not be a lot of value in comparing the size to talk about how bad the fire is. But I think it's important to keep in mind that as we go forward, and if we're successful in making a large portion of the landscape more resilient, the average size of the fire will be a real good indicator of how good we are at doing that.
Thank you. Yeah. Excellent. I'm not seeing any more, and just, you know, we got about 35 minutes before 5 o'clock. So we want to move on, but.
Yeah. Any other comments on goals? I mean, you'll see these slides, and definitely welcome more, thoughts going forward. And then, in the document itself, once we've sort of got an actual document to share with you, I think that's when you'll sort of see how these goals will fit in, and then there'll be a second round for sort of consideration. But the earlier the better in terms of getting these thoughts to us so we can really incorporate this the first time around. So really appreciate all that you've said so far. We're going to try to make sure we address all those and wrestle with them to the best of our ability. So now I want to move into financial implementation plan. And this is the question of like, okay, how do we fund all this? How do we get all this stuff actually done? And how do we get enough money to do it? So the MOU, uses to direct the investments and says develop a financial implementation plan that incorporates public-private partnership as well as many other things. And then there's also the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response, which sort of said build a long-term sustainable funding model. gave some other points there. And so where we started with this was thinking about what are the existing funding sources available to us. And you've seen this before, programs by agency from Oregon, from ODF, from OWEB, US Forest Service, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've done thus far is with very spotty information, I would say, very incomplete, but calculating up all the money that is currently available, being spent, and kind of projected for the next 10 years or so, sort of in hand at least. And it equals up to about $100 million. Actually, 106 is the information that I've got so far. And so that's about, let's see, now I'm forgetting, it's a 40-60 split. 46 state and about 61 federal in millions. And it's incomplete, but it's basically based on the data that I had. So that gives you a sense of, like, you know, sort of at least the current, some scale of, a minimum scale of the money that's being spent on this. And the way that we imagine this all working is, you know, taking the resources and kind of directing them to all of these geographies based on the local planning that's done at the local level with the collaborative groups and the agencies, et cetera. And so, you know, that is one way of thinking about this investment strategy, is really like taking all the money we have and directing it to those areas initially. Then there's the next question of, is that enough? And that's where we start thinking about, so this is sort of in words, kind of, you know, agencies focusing their resources and grants for priority geographies. But recognizing that all that decision making is up to the agencies themselves, and all of those programs have unique, you know, limitations and purposes and such. So really what we're trying to do is connect all those different programs into those agencies, into those priority geographies, and sort of connecting them across boundaries and across purposes. And that's where a lot of the work will happen, I think, in ASIG and at the SLG, is kind of thinking about the project areas, working with the local groups, and trying to connect all those resources. There's a second piece to this, or a third piece to this, which is identifying opportunities for new funding sources or expanding existing ones, or, you know, for areas for needs that we identify. For example, you know, maybe we need to invest in more around capacity and readiness, around planning, around agency sort of technical assistance. Maybe we need to invest in more mills. And so how do we get the resources for that? And so I think over time we will identify those opportunities and start finding ways to get more of that money. And then also looking at the capacity of the agencies and of the local groups to support all of this work. I mean, you know, there's always going to be barriers. Up until recently, it has been funding, but now we've got a lot of funding, and now it seems like in many ways, the real barrier is around, you know, human capacity to manage all of that work, and the technical capacity and the planning capacity and the on the ground capacity to do it, the contractor capacity to do it. So there's always going to be something in the way. We need to kind of find ways to kind of open those barriers up when they present themselves. And over 20 years, we're going to go back and forth around that, I would guess. And so it's going to be a kind of an iterative and emerging process that will have to be continually managed over time. But that is the way we've been thinking about this financial implementation plan. and strategy kind of thing. And so what I want to do now is just stop for a moment and, this is something that was in the MOU, was in 762. A lot of you had a role in putting this together, perhaps thought about this in some way. And I'm wondering if the way we're thinking about it is consistent with the way you're thinking about it, other things we should be thinking about. So I just want to open that up now for conversation to help us as we go forward with this part of the process. Who's that? John. John?
Yeah, under 3 new opportunities, the Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission will issue a report to Congress in September, and sometime after that, Congress will act on it. And I think it's probably not wise to predict what Congress might do, but that could be the source of significant new money.
What was the name of that?
This planning effort.
What was the name of that planning effort again?
Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission, USDA.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so that's an opportunity to try to get any new ideas going and accessing some of those funds once they become available. David?
Yeah, Dave?
Dave, your hand is up?
Yep, there we go. There we go.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Back in the world of living. The sources of funding that were listed, I saw a number of them that I know to have statutory limitations on what they can be spent upon. And a good example is with ODF&W, their access and habitat funding. That would never fly with the current legislation, nor would the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund funding be available without a change in the law. And man, would you have very big political issues with that. State wildlife grants is the same thing. I really think you better stay in a narrow area for sources of funding that directly relates to the forest in and of itself.
Let's explore this a moment, because this is a really important point, and I don't want to create an impression that this money would be spent towards wildfire treatments. But the way we've been thinking about it is that as we're looking at wildfire treatments, can we coordinate with other programs and other goals that are that overlap, that have similar joint interests? So, for example, with habitat, there's a habitat project going on, and there's a treatment project going on. Perhaps those two can be kind of coordinated. The work of the habitat work would be the habitat work only, but it could be coordinated with the treatment work so that they are working in harmony and sort of better outcomes rather than in conflict and perhaps doing each other harm. So that's the way we've been thinking about this. We probably haven't messaged that fully in this presentation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not that is an appropriate way of approaching this.
Well, having heard your challenges, just let me say again, these funding that are in the case of wildlife habitat, fisheries habitat, there is not any wiggle room as far as I can tell in the laws involved. Restoration and enhancement is the Pittman-Robinson-Dingell-Johnson Act on firearms and fish and tackle excise tax, and there's no wiggle room in that. Access and habitat is state, and there's no wiggle room in that. And how you would collaborate and cooperate with these programs of funding on a statewide basis, I just see that is an area that you probably just ought to stay out of until you figure out how to solve the restoration and enhancement. If there's an opportunity, these guys in ODFW would see it. I just think that is not a problem that we need to be dealing with on a restoration and enhancement.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's great feedback. Let's call them out.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Joseph?
Just one thing real quick that has bugged me on this slide is the private forest accord is decidedly different from the Northwest Forest Plan. And I'm not sure why it's under ODFW. Anyways, those are, so yeah, I mean, the private forest accord would be like probably better in like an ODF bucket in the Northwest Forest Plan under the Forest Service. But that's just a quibble. I was curious about the slide that you ended on and thinking about the funding as it applies, as it comes to the ground. And you mentioned like also some of the funding that's needed to actually do these projects and like the staffing issues. And I wondered, how much of that is explicitly called out here, or how are you thinking about, say, for example, the Forest Service doesn't have anybody to administer these contracts, and that's like a funding need on some level. Is that the type of thing you're thinking we call out here as part of the implementation plan? Like we need to staff up these agencies, or I wasn't clear what you meant there.
Yeah, it's certainly an option. I think agency capacity, I've heard many times, is a limitation to getting some of this work done. And so,
I agree.
So it seems like it's something on the table. I don't know if there's agreement yet for that, but
yeah, I would just say, I mean, that's what I see in Southern Oregon is that there's not a lot of contract administration specifically, and not a lot of enough fire staff to do burning, so like we have tens of thousands of acres of approved prescribed fire. We burn about 200 acres a year. Some of that is smoke, but a lot of that is just there's no people to do it, so I mean, yeah, calling that kind of stuff out I think would be pretty important. If you look at the recent wildfire crisis strategy that the Forest Service put out, it talks about all this prescribed fire, but like what's actually getting done is a fraction of a % of what is needed. So like calling that out I think is pretty key.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Carl.
Yeah, on the funding slide you had up earlier, it seemed like under Forest Service, you're missing one, at least that we use in our area. That's stewardship contracting, where you do a thinning in an area that has some fire benefits, then keep the retained receipts to do work elsewhere. And then second piece is on kind of what Dave was talking about earlier about the conservation funding. And this gets back to, when you look at resiliency on the landscape and trying to reduce fire risk, one of the strategies is keeping more water on the landscape. So conservation funding can actually, I think, go hand in hand with wildfire risk reduction if you're doing wetland enhancement, expansion projects, reconnecting rivers and streams to their floodplains. They have a large wetted floodplain, reintroducing the beaver into areas that make sense to kind of re-wet those areas. So it seems like water in the landscape is a good thing for fire, and conservation funding and habitat funding does fund those kind of projects. So I do see nexus there, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl. Amanda?
Yeah, I guess to that end that Carl brought up, you know, stewardship contracting and retained receipts. There's also KV authority where even in traditional timber sales are typically like timber sale pipeline sales. This is getting like super nerdy, but there's other types of funding structures within the Forest Service. I mean, those are decisions that the Forest Service would make for Forest Service priorities, recognizing we want to participate with them and they're engaged within the leadership team, or I can't remember what the acronym is called, Nathan, with all the agency folks, leadership folks. You know, there's other things there that we might be missing on there, but I don't know if those are specific types of funds that we would be including in this. So anyways, I guess I'm a bit, I don't know exactly how broad we want to be. I mean, Dan, you've done a great job, and Nathan really trying to capture all the different pots and pools and you know, places where money goes to and comes from. But Dave's comment on, you know, recognizing that there are limitations and who has access or doesn't have access to certain funds and what the funds can or can't be used for. I think that's important, but I'm hoping that those are some of the things that you guys are going to be working through for the plan, right?
That's the intent.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and as you can see, like, you know, we're in the middle of thinking about this. And so we've come some way, but we've got a lot more to do. We haven't presented all of this yet to ASIG or the SLG, the leadership group. So in many, as sort of a fluke of sequencing, you get stuff first, which is maybe beneficial and maybe scary. So, but it's helpful for us to bounce stuff by you. So, yeah.
Excellent. And Dave, I see your hand is raised. Maybe just hang over from the previous comment, unless you have another comment. Otherwise, do we have more to move on to?
Well, let's move on.
All right. Sounds good. All right. So then the last piece of this that we wanted to share with you is metrics and accountability. And this is just stuff from the MOU and 762 about, you know, sort of our guiding stuff. And so the way we thought about this is sort of a system. And so I try to put this graph together to show how it kind of fits all together. The goals and metrics, as I mentioned earlier, sort of establish this. And we've got this, you know, the system then becomes the dashboard, which tracks, you know, our effectiveness at meeting our goals and metrics. And that information then also goes into the decision support system, which is sort of being updated continually with new information about what's been done, what still needs to be done. We've got the SARA group, which I mentioned, will sort of be a kind of, you know, science resource group for answering some of the big questions that
Did anyone else lose audio for the ODF room?
Yeah, I can't hear you guys anymore.
Yeah, all of a sudden you guys, we stopped being able to hear you.
I imagine we'll be doing is continually working with this group, the stakeholder group, to bounce these ideas. And I suspect that you will become much more of a kind of, I don't know if, you know, accountability watchdog will be the right term, but, you know, so you'll be tracking to make sure that we are achieving our goals and metrics, and you know, helping us ensure that we do one way or the other. At least that's what my hope. And so this is sort of the system that I kind of imagine coming forward. So take each of these in turn, the dashboard. This is an example of a couple of dashboards that we found from elsewhere. We're thinking about putting something like these together, but we haven't yet land on anything, but you can sort of see, like, there's maps and there's sort of key components, and you may want to do this in a variety of different ways or such, but this is an example of what others have done. And then there's the decision support system, and we've presented this before, where we're sort of looking at this as a broad system for sharing data and drawing from information from agencies, from the QWRA. There's going to be, of course, an update, so we're going to want to take that in. What the local groups are saying, all the science from academia and NGOs and others. And so bringing those folks in when needed to address some of the big questions. And these are some of the questions that I imagine we're going to ask Sarah to help us resolve. And some of you will probably be tapped for this as well. Defining and measuring a resilient landscape. How do we actually do that? Is what we're doing effective on the ground? Science and our understanding of the world evolves, and what we thought was right 20 years ago has changed now probably, and may change again over 20 years. So what we think is right now is probably not what we're going to think 20 years. But then also, again, how much is enough? I mentioned the 40% number. Is that really right? Time will tell, and we'll try to sort of adjust as we go. The question of what our desired future condition is, considering climate change, how do we sort of factor that piece of things into this whole process? And we've identified both sort of the long-term 20-year priorities and sort of the near-term priorities, but how do we decide when we're ready to move on, and what are those next priority areas? That's something that we've got an inkling of now, but we're going to need science to help us develop that. And same thing with maintenance. That was also something that came on. There's like, just because we've treated something once in the course of 20 years, it will probably grow and therefore need maintenance along the way. And so how do we consider that? And those are things that we don't have good answers for now, I don't think. And we're not going to try to define that in a firm, solid way by June, but we hope to sort of have those discussions and explore those questions and get better answers as we go forward over the next 3 to 5 years, as we set up Sarah and the decision support system and do some of this work. And so those are kind of part of this whole accountability process. So before I move on to the near-term actions, the next set of things, I just wanted to ask, as thinking about accountability, does that feel sufficient? Are there things you would want to see that we haven't addressed here yet? And I'll sort of go back to this slide here for sort of a conversation around this, if there's any thoughts. Pete?
Yeah, appreciate the presentation there. I guess I'll preface this by saying we lost audio of what you were saying, Dan, in the middle of this slide for 30 seconds maybe-ish. So you may have said this and we couldn't hear you. I sort of, I guess I feel like at the end of the day too, when you think about ODF and the long-term sort of ask of the agency here to develop this 20-year strategy, it feels to me like, at least from, again, the state agency perspective, the Board of Forestry at the end of the day is a group that needs to be holding the accountability reins, so to speak, with how ODF is doing on this. Perhaps you said that. And then similarly, given the kind of context within the statewide shared stewardship MOU, the other signatory parties to those similarly need to be holding their agencies accountable to implementation, learning, and continued refinement, improvement in how we're executing this 20-year strategy. So again, I don't know if you said that, but I would like, I heard something about using us as the accountability watchdog, and that's all fine and well, but I don't know that that's necessarily our role per se. So again, I could have got all that wrong because we didn't hear some of what you were saying, but that's just an initial take.
Yeah, and I guess I don't want to saddle you with that responsibility. No, but more I've thought about what role does this group, this stakeholder group, take on once we've developed the strategy? And I imagine it's in some ways a kind of, sort of outsider oversight role. I mean, it doesn't have to be, we could just disband, but I think that there's sort of an opportunity to hold us accountable for what we said we were going to do. And we wanted, well, I shouldn't be saying this because I'm not a we here, but like, I think ODF really does want to do this. And so it's not so much your responsibility as just sort of a potential role for this group going forward. I think that all of it, by shining lights and keeping the information public, that in itself is sort of an accountability mechanism. And so I guess that's sort of more what I meant. It is up to ODF to do its job and live up to its promises, as it is for all the agencies. And I think that will happen through the SLG, through the strategic leadership group, and the support that we give it. How does that reflect on what you were hoping for?
I appreciate that. I like the idea of transparency with some sort of a stakeholder body. And I think having external partners involved in that is important. I'm not quite sure that this group is still, I would argue that this group maybe isn't quite the right composition or doesn't have enough representation of some of the focal geographies if we're sort of starting to zero in on some of these seven landscape areas or regional areas. So just for what it's worth, I think there's great value in having some sort of a governance structure that works with the agencies, the strategic leadership group, et cetera, over time, and can provide some of that external accountability, as you're saying. And I think it's important that it's paired with internal accountability coming from both the leadership themselves of those agencies, but also the staff to implement.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's perhaps that's something more that we should explore more in future conversations. Yeah.
Amanda?
Yeah, on that point, I mean, I agree with Pete that ultimately I have felt for a while that the board is really missing from that governance flow chart that we've seen. And I do feel like part of their role would be in accountability, holding the department accountable as sort of the convener of this program or of this document. But in addition to that, I mean, Susan Jane, I'd like your perspective here. What about the Wildfire Programs Advisory Committee or Council, whatever it's called? I mean, I don't know if that group is slated to continue moving forward. I know it's still in place, following or looking to still be in place following the end of the biennium. But I mean, that group would be another accountability measure that reports directly to the governor's office. So, I mean, Susan Jane, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good question, but I don't know as though I can answer it because that group has been focused on some pretty specific tasks that are required by the legislation. And there hasn't been a whole, and that scope of work is like robust and deadlines are coming. And so we've been focusing on that. And so there hasn't really been, at least, and I haven't made all of the meetings, but as far as I know, there hasn't been a whole bunch of conversation about how that group may evolve and what it might do next. And so, and I think that would also, frankly, largely sort of be up to our new governor. So I don't know. I mean, I think it is, to your point, I think there are other potential accountability entities out there that we should be thinking about. And the appropriateness of bringing them into this conversation.
This has been really good. I really appreciate this. And I'd also offer, I'd like to hear more thoughts kind of on this aspect as well. I'm gonna move us on to kind of wrap us up, and as always, try to end when we say we're going to end. But I also offer any one-on-one conversations that people have thoughts about this. Please give me a call, and we can also continue because we're starting to dive deeper into this. So really appreciate these thoughts. And then with that, so Dan, I'll have you kind of got a few more slides, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, we go through the last of them.
Yeah.
All right. So the last set of slides here is just like what's going to happen, what we're thinking about would happen once we've published or finished, basically starting in July, after we've finished this work. So the goal is to like get this document endorsed by the strategic leadership group in June. The next step then is to publish and publicize the 20-year strategy. And we expect that that'll take a few months to actually produce a nice document with photos and layout and get signatures from all of the leaders and things like that. But that's the whole idea, is that probably by August, September, perhaps having a document that we can put out, and then also maybe having a press conference where we publicize it. And then a second point, which may be at the same time, or maybe they may be coordinated or maybe not, is convening a kind of a strategy kickoff summit, which would bring together the agencies, the regional groups, the GIS folks, the tribal folks, and others who are involved in all of this, and have a conversation about how to actually implement this and how to sort of move this forward, and deal with some of the pieces of it, how to deal with the capacity and readiness and all the other things, and everything else that's involved in sort of making this real. And so those are two things that we're imagining. We're also then thinking about engaging with the local groups and tribes to advance the planning, implementation, and capacity building. And so this involves implementing treatments where possible, advancing capacity and readiness where necessary, perhaps developing MOUs with local groups, supporting planning and assessments. We've talked a lot about that, about the local planning and assessments, and providing funding and technical assistance to local groups to sort of make all that possible. And then also dealing with the agency capacity, which we mentioned as well, needs to sort of be consistent with the needs. And then standing up the SARA group and a decision support system, which is already being worked on by INR. And so that is sort of in process now. We just need to kind of keep going on that. Building the dashboard that we talked about for accountability. And so that is the sort of primary actions that we're thinking about after June, after we've sort of gotten agreement on this document. So I just wanted to share that with you, that we're starting to think about what happens after June. And more information will be coming forward, and happy to have your thoughts on all of this and more. The other thing I wanted to highlight is a review process. And we quickly pivoted because we had a whole review process based around the SLG meetings, which just got changed a bit today. And so what we're thinking now is that our next stakeholder, the May stakeholder meeting will happen May 9th. So what we're thinking now is that you will see the first draft a week before that, May 2nd. And that'll give you a week to review it. We'll talk about it together at that May meeting. And then you'll have another week to sort of provide written comments as well. And then you'll see the SLG meeting there is May 19th. And then we'll provide you with a second draft, June 6th. And then we've got the June 13th stakeholder meeting. And then I'm forgetting, we didn't get to put in the June, I hope that's the right date for that. And so that'll give a second chance to kind of comment on the changes. So we wanted to give you a sense of what we're thinking in terms of reviewing and giving you a chance to look at these documents and get any sort of input that you want to provide and help so that we can get this as good as possible. So open to comments on the previous slide and this one in terms of review process and whether it makes sense, and any other thoughts. All right, seeing none, at least no hands are up.
Thanks, Carl. Got thumbs up.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it back then.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And just to note too, really the idea, you know, within the draft and the strategies, a lot of this information, that's why we want to have this kind of full look at it and getting feedback and where we need to refine. So just as always, really appreciate all the comments. I know Dan's taking a lot of notes. We've been jotting stuff down. So we're, as always, going to download from this and incorporate it. And then also continuing conversations with other groups. So like we had mentioned, next meeting we have April 13th. So in a month, just want to throw that out there, and we'll keep digging into some of the back end stuff of this, keep diving into the goals, et cetera. And then also just a reminder, we're starting to have deeper conversations on some of these goals, et cetera. So we're going to be really driving to refine those, et cetera. So with that, as always, welcome conversations from now until April 11th. If anybody has ideas or thoughts, send us stuff, but also one-on-one conversations. I always really enjoy those, and really helps us form our thoughts as well. So, and then the other thing was, I heard a lot about wanting to look at slides. We get those posted. We'll have them posted by, I'm gonna say a week. We'll kind of under promise, over deliver, but we're gonna try to get those as quick as possible. But once again, those are on the website, labeled as meeting number 7. And then also recommend going back to meeting number 6 that has some of the previous data and maps, et cetera. So we like to be very transparent with all of those, and they're all posted along with the agendas and recordings of those meetings. So just wanted to throw that out there. And we do really like that if you take this information and then spend some time with it in between meetings to really download and think about it and process, because I know it is challenging to respond right away to this information sometimes when you think about it. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up and get us out of here for the evening. But just a special thank you and really to Dan coming down and all the work that he's doing, and really the work that everyone's doing. So with that, have a wonderful evening. Really appreciate it, and really looking forward to the next conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.